In the previous video, we looked at the planning stages of creating our leap year checker application, and we created the IPO chart, a storyboard, and an algorithm represented by a flowchart to help us build our project. Now we're ready to actually get in and start building. So I'm in Visual Studio. I'm going to go to the File menu, choose New. I want a new project, and we can create projects with different languages, different platforms, and different idioms in terms of the style of the application, whether it's desktop, mobile app, console, and so forth. So we're going to create a Visual Basic application for Windows that's a desktop application. You see there's a bunch of different things here we can still choose. These will all change as we modify our type of project up here. But I get one here that says Windows Form App, Visual Basic, Windows, and Desktop. And that's what we're going to create throughout this course is our Windows Forms apps. So I also, once you create one, it'll show up here under your recent project template. So I have Windows Form App for Visual Basic at the top. And I also have one for C#. We're using Visual Basic here. So I'm going to choose Visual Basic. I'm going to say Next. And then I need to give it a project name. This is our first project. So I'm going to say A01. A stands for assignment. So A01. This is going to be leap year. And then put your name in parentheses. Choose where you want to save this. So I have a folder set up for Visual Basic or CS150AB. We're going to create a new solution. I'm going to check this box here that says place solution and project in the same directory. That's actually something kind of new in recent versions of Visual Studio. It does, I think, make it a little bit easier for you when it comes to zipping your project together to upload it into our Canvas shell for me to look at. So go ahead and check that, and I'm going to click Next. We can choose the framework. We have some different frameworks here based on what's installed in your Visual Studio. The most recent, as of right now, is .NET 8. That's a long-term solution. And then there's .7, which is a standard term solution. The even ones are always the long-term. The odd ones, 5 and 7, are standard term. And those odd ones represent some minor changes, where the even ones represent major changes. You probably want to choose the most recent, so I'm going to choose .NET 8 and click Create. I'm going to say Save. It's going to create a bunch of files for me, setting this all up. And now I'm in the IDE editor, and I get my form, Form 1. Now Form is the name we use for a window. So I have a form or a window called Form 1. Over here is my Solution Explorer. I can see Form 1. Now if for some reason you were to reopen this maybe, or it didn't come up, you can come over and just always double click on that, and that'll open the form. Over on the left hand side is our toolbox, and we're going to use this to create objects or controls on our form. And then also we have the Solution Explorer on the right, but below that are the properties. That's the default setup. You can actually change the lookup and feel of your IDE to however you prefer, but this is the way it is out of the box. And I'm going to make sure I have my Form 1 selected. We'll see the handles around on the corners and on the sides. I also see in properties it says Form 1. We're going to make a couple changes here. So I'm going to come down to the text property. By the way, in this window, so in the properties panel, shows this little wrench here, we can view this by category, or we can view it alphabetically. Those are the first two little selections there in the properties panel. I always like to view it alphabetically. It's easier for me to find things alphabetically because I may not know what category property is in. So I'm going to come down to the T and find the text. Right now it says Form 1. That's the default. I'm going to change this to A01 Leap Year Checker. And again, I'm going to put my last name in parentheses. Now as soon as I press the Enter key, we're going to see up at the top here that the title has changed on the title bar of a window. Now with our form or window, we have three little boxes over here on the right hand side. So we have a minimize, a maximize, and a close box. Those are standard in Windows, and they're pre-defined for us. Those all are functional. In fact, if we were to run this, we click the green arrow up here on the top. Shows my project name. It's going to launch this into Windows, and I can actually minimize it. I can maximize it, bring it back, or I can toggle that off. The minimize will put it down on the status bar, or I can close it. by clicking the X. The other thing I want to do in this project is change the size of my form. Now I can drag this visually and get the size I want, or I can come over to the size property and type in a size. We're going to type in 560, 360. And the 560 is the width and the 360 is the height. I'm also going to come up to the background color. Remember, these are again alphabetized, so back color. Click the down arrow there, and we can choose the console colors. We can choose a web color, or we can go to system, and these are defined by how your computer is set up. If you use system, it may look different on different computers because each computer may be set up differently in terms of the color scheme. I'm going to go to web. I'm just going to scroll down into the blues. I'm going to choose this Alice blue. It's a very light blue. Now we're going to build our UI visually by taking tools from our toolbox, adding them to our form, and changing the properties. And to more easily do that, so I don't have to keep zooming in and zooming out and showing you what I'm changing, I'm going to drag the properties panel over from its docking station on the right hand side. I'm just going to place it over here on the just the right of my window. I'm going to expand that out just a little bit. So I'm going to begin with a label. I'm going to take the label tool. I can either drag that label over, or I can also draw a box for that label. This is going to be our title up at the top. And then in the properties, I'm going to scroll up, and there is a property called auto size, and it's set to true. And that causes the size of that box to expand or shrink based on the contents. And a lot of times I like to set that to false. So now I get the box and I can see it a little more clearly. And I'm going to change the text here. So we're going to the text property and type, is it a leap year? Question mark. And I get the text appearing in my label, but it's a little small. I also want to have this centered. So I'm going to go to the text align, and we'll drop down here. I'm going to choose this middle center. That puts it in the middle of my box for the label. And I'm going to go to the font property, and I'm using Sego UI. You can use Arial if you don't have that. I'm going to set this to be bold, and I want a larger font size. We can choose 36. By the way, you can also type in sizes here. Maybe I want 34. It doesn't show up on my box, but I can enter that. And there then is my kind of bold title at the top of my window. I'm going to take another label. This time I'm just going to click. And so I get the label. I'm going to set the text to enter year, and then I'm going to put YYY, Y, so 4 Y's, and a colon. And let's make that a little bit larger as well. So I'll go back to font. And let's make this 18 point. You can drag position in place. To the right of that, I want to add a text box. I'm going to scroll down in my toolbox and find the text box. And again, I'm just going to drag and create a box. Now it's going to resize it based on the font size. So let's go ahead and change this font size while we're here in the properties. We'll make this 24 point. I'd also like to make it bold. And then for the text, I'm going to enter 2024. And I want to have this aligned to the right. Numbers, I like to align them to the right. You can choose the center if you want. Now my text box is plenty large because it's not going to be that big in terms of a year. It's always going to be 4 digits. I can make that a little smaller if I wanted. Last thing I'm going to do here is change the back color of this. Let's give it a nice little light yellow. So here I'll use the custom. I'm just going to choose this lightest yellow at the top. Now I'm going to move these around a little bit so they're a little more centered. Let's add a button. So again, in the toolbox, I'm going to go to the button, drag a button, and I can grab a corner and resize it. The text of my button is going to be test it. And I'll use an exclamation mark on it. Let's make that size a little bit larger as well. So go to font. Oh, before I do, let me show you one other thing here. I'm going to cancel that. There's a little plus sign over here on the font. You can choose to look at all the different properties for fonts and change one individually, or you can do it in that dialog. If I just wanted to change the size here, I can come into size and I can type in a new size. We'll make that 18 point, and I'm going to set the bold to true. Now, one thing I want to do here is name this button. So any object we're going to use in code, we probably want to give it a meaningful name. Every object has a name, and you'll see the names up at the top. Even in the alphabetized settings, the name's going to be at the top here. So right now it's named button 1. That's not very meaningful. If I had 5 buttons, I'd have button 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but those aren't meaningful in code. So I'm going to name this BTN, that's Hungarian notation for button, and we're just going to call it BTN test. I capitalize the T, it's camel casing. We can't have any spaces or special characters in our names. It has to be one word. So I capitalize the first letter of each subsequent word in the name. So that tells me this is my test button. I want to go back and name my text box. I'm going to click on the text box, and now look at the controls for the text box. It's going to name text box 1 by default. I'm going to name it TXT. That's my Hungarian notation for a text box. And we're going to name it TXT year with a capital Y. One more thing we're going to do for our application is we're going to add another label. I'm actually just going to take this label and copy and paste, drag it down here. I want to set the font of this label to be a little bit smaller. So we're going to set the size to 21 point, but I am going to use a different font here. I want my Seago UI black. I'll make it a little bit bigger as well, a little bit bolder. Okay, so that's going to be our output. I want to change the text here to be enter a year and click test it. Let's go ahead and capitalize the T on test it. And I made a typo in my spelling of enter. So enter a year and click test it. Now, I do want to refer to this in code, so I want to make sure that I'm naming this object as well. So scroll up, and let's change this from label 3 to LBL output with a capital O. Now, I didn't bother to name label 1 or label 2. We're not going to refer to those in code, so I don't take the time to name those. The only ones I'm referring to code are going to be the TXT year, the BTN test, and the LBL output. That's our interface. Next, we're going to write the code for our test it button. And the easiest way to do that, we're going to handle a click event, which is the default event for a button. If you just double click on that, it will create a event handler in our code behind for that button, for that click event. I'm going to double click. It's going to take me over now to the code for Form 1 VB. So notice we have our design up here at the top. I can go back to that, on that tab, go back to the interface. But here's my Form 1 VB, which is the code. I'm going to take my properties panel. I'm just going to redock it over here on the bottom. Get that out of the way. And now I'm ready to write my code. So here's our code. Private sub btn test underscore click. That's the name of my event procedure. It created that name based on the name of the object and the event being handled. But I could change that to anything I want. Might want to name it Fred. And then I've got some parameters here in parentheses. So sender's object, E is event args. We don't want to mess with that at this point. That's going to tell us which object was clicked and what the event was. In this case, it's a click event. And here it tells us what it's handling. It's handling the btn test dot click. So our object dot in the event. Now we can write our code in between that. So when we click on the button, we're going to tell it what to do. I'm going to pause the video here and just enter my code and then come back and I'll walk you through it. Here's the code for handling the click event of btn test. I don't expect you to understand the code at this point, but I will walk you through briefly what's happening here. So line by line, this dim myYear as integer is I'm setting up a variable in our random access memory to hold an integer. Dim stands for dimension. And what's going to contain is what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign. It's going to contain the text that is in our text box named txtYear. Now that's of a data type called string. I need to convert this into a data type called integer. That's what the integer.parse does. So it's a method, and inside the parentheses of that method, I'm specifying what I want to convert. I want to convert that text. Then we're going to look at that value of myYear. It's an integer. So I'm going to divide it by 4. And this mod divides by the number here, which is 4, and returns the remainder. So if I divide by 4 and get no remainder, it's evenly divisible by 4. That tells me it's a leap year. Except if it's divisible by 100 and equal to 0, it is not a leap year. So here I say if it's divisible by 4 and is 0, and in myYear modulus operation of 100, give this remainder, is not 0, not equal to, is this less than greater than sign in Visual Basic. So if it's not divisible by 100 evenly, but it is divisible by 4 evenly, then I know it's a leap year. And I put a comment here preceded by a little apostrophe or a single quote. This causes the compiler to ignore anything. You can put comments in your code to remind you what you did or what's happening here. So my comment is leap year is evenly divisible by 4 but not by 100. Well, what I want to do in this case, this is called an if-else end-if conditional structure. So if this is true, we're going to do this. But if that is not true, if that is false, we're going to do this. That's where the else comes in. So if that's true, we're going to set the text of our LBL output label to yes, and with the name of the year. This is called string interpolation. So I have a $sign here, a literal string, yes, and then the variable I want to substitute in there is a leap year. Otherwise, I'm going to say no, the year is not a leap year. And if it is a leap year, I'm going to set the color to forest green. If it's not, I'm going to set it to red. Let's just try this. So here's my application running. Right now I've got 2024 as the year. If I say test it, I'm told yes, it's a leap year. If I change this to 2025, no, it's not a leap year. Now, something like 2000 is evenly divisible by 100. That's also not a leap year. Now, one little sticking point here is I might change this year, but it's still, if I'm not paying attention here, I'm not noticing the year here and it's saying, oh, that's not a leap year when it should be. So what I want to have happen is when we change this, I want this to go back to that text of entering a year and clicking the test it button. So I'm going to go back to my design. This is another way of debugging. Even though everything works fine, we may find ways that we want to improve this. That goes back to the SDLC being cyclical. So I'm going to go back to my design. This time I'm going to double click on the text box, and that the default handle is when that text changes. So I'm going to double click on it, and now I'm getting another procedure here, another event handler, txtYear underscore text changed, and it's handling txtYear dot text changed. And what I want to do is I'm going to copy this code here and just reuse it. And I'm going to change the expression here to enter a year and click test it. And I want this to be black. All right, let's test that. So now I test it. If I come in here to change this, notice my text is changing down here to enter a year and click test it. So I'm not seeing the answer until I click test it. So we're handling two events here. One is the button click, the other one is the text changed of our text box. And that's our project. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Programming Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.